Can you imagine a world without electricity? I mean, no cell phones, TV, radios, computers, coffee makers, lights. I can just go on and on. All I can tell you is that I don't want to live in that world. But did you ever wonder how the amazing world of electricity came to be? I mean, it all had to start somewhere, right? Well, my guest today, Kathy Joseph, has recently written a book titled The Lightning Tamers, and it tells the true stories of the dreamers and schemers who harnessed electricity and transformed our world. Now, if you're thinking this could be a boring read with, complex science and lots of math, I assure you that it's not. This is a book that has been written with the non-scientist in mind. In fact, The Lightning Tamers is a fascinating read, and it's filled with quirky and unusual stories, just like the ones you find in this podcast, and I assure you there's no math. I do think you're going to enjoy what you're about to hear, so please welcome Kathy Joseph to today's podcast. I am Steve Soldman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
So, Kathy, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Steve. This is so much fun.
Yeah, when I was first contacted, oddly, I had seen your videos and I enjoyed them. So I had a little bit of an insight, but I asked for a copy of your book to be sent to me simply because I was afraid, it's physics and it may blow some people away. And that's not really what my audience is about. But I was really surprised how easy it was to read. Just that it wasn't complicated at all. It's not that it's super simplified, written for dummies, but it's a book that anyone can read. And when you did get into some of the technical points, I thought you did an excellent job of explaining it. You could tell you were a teacher at one point.
Thanks so much. I wrote it for adults who think they can't understand the world. Sorry. I wrote it for adults who think they can't understand the world, who think that the word physics means that they can't understand it. And I wrote it sort of as a beach read, because when you tell the stories of the people instead of the science, you tell the stories of the science through the people, it becomes an interesting story automatically. These people all had quirky lives and all were strange and funny and interesting. And we can always connect to some part of them.
Yeah, I have to say, quirky is a good way to put it. I was really surprised. Well, I wouldn't say surprised, but it's interesting how so many of these people had no scientific background. A lot of them who made really big advances in science, they were not accepted by the scientific community. People just refused because they weren't part of the establishment to accept what they had discovered. And the other thing is, as I'm reading this book, all I could think is, today we go to the store and we buy our batteries and we buy our wire, whatever. We need lumber, whatever. They didn't have any of this. These people had to create their own source of electricity. They needed to, I don't know where they got wires from. All I could think is like barbed wire fencing or something. And the other thing that really stood out to me is this is before there was any kind of communication. How did this knowledge move all across Europe, and then Ben Franklin, learns about it in the US? It's just crazy how all this knowledge got around. So maybe you want to comment a little bit on that.
Where they found the material always struck me. There was a physicist in the United States named Joseph Henry, and he got his wire from his wife's haberdashery. They made the petticoats. He went to the place where she got her petticoats and got the wires for the petticoats, and the wrapping up, it was in silk for the thing, and used that for his wire. He was actually a high school teacher.
Well, you just said high school teacher. I have to tell you, my wife, she just resigned from her job at the end of the summer. The workload just got too much. She worked for 22 years at the Albany Academy, where he got his education, and they have a Joseph Henry Science Fair every year. The Albany Academy actually moved its location many years ago, but the original building is still there, and there's a large statue of Joseph Henry right outside. So I was actually thinking many years ago doing a podcast on him. And I did go, my wife arranged for me to meet with a historian for the school, and they have like a whole library of his instruments and, documents and everything else. But I never got to it. Somehow I just pushed it off, and the podcast just went off in a different direction. So, but anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. It was just, you mentioned Joseph Henry.
Oh no, speaking of someone not in science, he was going to be an actor, and then he got a cold, and he was recovering at his mom's house, and they were renting out rooms, and someone left a children's textbook there, and he reads it, and he's like, "Nope, I'm going to do science." Okay, I didn't graduate from high school. Mind you, he's in his early 20s by this point. So he goes back to the high school and manages to become a tutor while he's a student, learning how to do this stuff, and then becomes a high school teacher at the same high school, the same place you were mentioning where your wife worked. And then he was doing all these great experiments. Basically, what his experiments were, they'd figured out that if you wrapped a coil around an iron bar and put electricity in the iron bar, it could pick up things. And then if you drop the electricity, it would drop. And he just tried to figure out the biggest things he could pick up and drop. And he was mentioning how like everyone was really shocked when these really heavy weights would crash the ground. And he also figured out, in the meanwhile, he also figured out not only the heaviest things he could pick up, but the furthest things he could pick up. He realized that if you connected the batteries different ways, you could get signals to go a lot longer. And that is why he is partially the father of the telegraph. He
Sure.
actually set up the first telegraph in this
Yeah.
high school.
I think they actually have a model of it there. It's
Mm.
not on display. It's in their library with the historian. Um, yeah, he's kind of forgotten today, unfortunately. Even here up in Albany, I think if you mentioned to even at the Albany Academy, I bet most kids don't know who Joseph Henry is. But he did go on, of course, to because my understanding is, and this is just kind of based on what I've read, so I can't say it's factually correct, that he was considered the most preeminent scientist of his day in the United States, not worldwide, but in the United States. And therefore, when the US government got their money, when Smithson died and left his money to the United States for the establishment of a scientific institute, that's the Smithsonian today, he was called upon to, come down to Washington. And of course, I believe they actually, if you walk in the old building, I think they do have like maybe like his tomb or something there. I'm not sure, or maybe it's just a plaque. But it seems to me in my vague memory that there's a tomb, or they brought the tombstone there or something. But anyway, we're
You
going off on
can't
a
see me
tangent. But
nodding, except for the tomb part, which I'm not sure about. Yeah, no,
yeah.
but he was at the high school. Then they hired him at Princeton when it was
Hmm.
called something else, even though, as he said, he's not a graduate of any college. He actually complained bitterly about Princeton because he said that the labs at the high school were far better than the labs at Princeton. But when he published about different ways to pick up all those weights and to get that big distance, that was the first important scientific discovery from America since Benjamin Franklin. And so, yes, he was very, very popular. And he did become the first director of the Smithsonian. And they kept every single letter he wrote. And the Smithsonian did, like, to an obsessive degree. It's a little bit difficult to
Sure.
parse through what's important and what isn't because there's what's there. Unless you're writing a book only on him, I'm sure then it's
And I'm
pretty.
sure there must be many volumes written on him at this point.
Yes,
Because
there are, but like you said, he became less famous. But in the 1800s, he was incredibly famous. And I have a little story about Alexander Graham Bell and him. So Alexander Graham Bell had this crazy idea for a telephone, which he called a telephone. And he went to see Joseph Henry and tell him about it. And he told Joseph Henry about it. And he said, the problem is, Bell said, the problem is, I don't know very much science. I don't know any science. And then Henry turned to him and said, well, get it. And Bell said that that was the most important 2 words he ever heard and inspired him to continue on his way. So I like that part.
Yeah. And of course, he did very well for himself with those 2 words of advice.
Yes, he did.
So before we go further, I thought maybe you give a little background about yourself, how you how what you studied in college, what your career was, how you started doing videos on YouTube, and what led you to the book. So once you give a little overview of that.
Overview of my life. Well, I studied physics in college at the University of Chicago. I've always felt like science was sort of like someone doing a mystery, not a mystery, someone doing a magic show, and then they tell you how the magic works. And that was always what I enjoyed. And I always enjoyed the teaching aspect of it because I always enjoyed other people going, oh, wow, I couldn't do the magic of the magic trick with the cards. I don't have the manual dexterity for them to be a magician, but I do have the mental dexterity to be a physicist magician. And that's what I wanted to do. So I studied physics, and then I went into graduate school because I thought I wanted to be a professor. But turns out I love learning, but I did not love the research the way they have it set up in universities. So I got a master's in physics, and then I got a master's in something called engineering science, which was fun. And then I went to grad school again. And then I decided that all I want to be is a high school teacher. So I did that for many, many years, and I enjoyed it tremendously. And I feel like I got a good part of my education from teaching high school students.
Well, as I mentioned before, we set the mic, we turned on the recording. I was a high school physics teacher for 27 years, and I knew nothing when I first started. I mean, I have a degree in geology. I took basic physics 1 and 2 in college, and that was it. So when I started teaching, I was one day ahead of the kids. But just like you said, I mean, I learned. I never learned I never understood anything I learned in college till I had to teach it to others. That's where the learning really takes place. When you have to explain it to somebody else, you really better know your stuff, you know?
We were talking earlier about my favorite scientist, a guy named Michael Faraday.
Hmm.
And Michael Faraday started this thing where he taught kids, but he meant like high school kids. He gave a special lecture on Christmas a day about science. This is related, I promise.
Oh,
And it started this connection where he would do this thing every year and he would teach about science. And they were so inspirational that Charles Dickens wrote him once and asked him for his notes so he could put it in his magazine so he
wow.
could inspire people with how to learn science. And it was inspirational to encouraging people to learn science through inquiry and not just through not just science, but everything through inquiry and not just through rote memorization. And this idea you can just open up the brain and pour the ideas in.
Sure.
And they still do these Christmas lectures. And if you look at the list of people who've done the Christmas lecture, it's people like Carl Sagan and David Attenborough. Did I say that name right?
Yes, you did.
And all these amazing people who learned that if it if there's one thing to have this great knowledge and to have it to be able to teach it to people who already understand all the basics, but to understand it really, you have to teach it to people who don't understand the basics, because that's when you get the great questions you just didn't think of before. And like I said, I went to graduate school for many, many times. I have more education than most PhDs in
Hmm.
physics, but I really learned it when I taught it in high school, because that's when I learned what things other people got confused by. Oh, radio waves are not sound waves, they're invisible light waves. And I can just say that. And then people get it wrong on the test over and over again.
Oh,
So,
I had that every year. I would say every year, but let's say every second or third Regents exam here in New York State on the physics exam, they'd ask that, and I knew they're going to get that wrong because no matter how many times and they'll play around with it, but it just never quite sinks in. They think radio waves have to be sound. They don't realize it, that it's light.
and I think that in order for that to I didn't do this as much when I was a teacher. So I was a teacher for many, many years and I loved it. And I had a video I showed about which was called Einstein's Big Idea. But the part about it that I showed was one where a young Michael Faraday was living a life of, he had no education and he was working binding books, and his boss let him read the books and do sometimes the experiments in them when there was books with experiments in them. And he ended up getting a job with this chemistry professor, and the video was about that sort of process. And it was so inspiring to me, because the experiment that he did in the video, that was a recreation of the original one, was similar to the experiment that I had been doing for my students, to show them how electricity is in the wire and the magnetic field is around the wire. And I had no idea that when that was first discovered, they didn't realize that the magnetic field went in a circle around the
Sure.
wire. Because I was always told Oersted discovered circular magnetic field, and it was never displayed as like, why this was unusual, why this was different, what Oersted thought was going on. And once I realized that I could study the people were so fascinating to me, and how they got it. And like you were saying, how they did these experiments. Faraday writes a friend, he's like, so, dear A, the guy's name was Alexander. Dear A, I went and I got pennies and I got this, and you will be amazed, A. It bubbled because he made a battery and he made it have a chemical reaction, and he was so excited. And I'm so excited by physics, and it's such a connection to realize these people aren't otherworldly. They're just dorks like me who like understanding the world. And it made me feel like such a connection to them, but it also made me feel like I that was the teaching. Two things really changed my understanding of reality in
Yeah,
terms
I
of physics.
totally agree.
The first one was high school, sorry,
Mhm,
and the second one was the history.
mhm. I wouldn't say I have quite the depth and knowledge of, the history behind physics itself like you do, but I always tried, whatever I was teaching, I always try to give a little bit of, the background story on it. And I think that made things more interesting, more real for the kids. Um, but there's only so much time in the day. You can't spend, you could throw in a story at the beginning of this or wherever and where they came up, but it'd be great if you could just sit there and stand there and just tell stories every day and not teach anything. But at the end, I had to teach the entire curriculum.
I honestly, I think the more I think that teaching it through the history, actually it makes the science difficulty um, increase in difficulty from simpler to more complicated, because you start with the first people who didn't know anything. So they didn't know anything. So your audience doesn't know anything. So you don't have to say, okay, magnets are different from static electricity. You can just say, this person figured out magnets are different from static electricity. This is what instead of, why don't you guys do a little experiment to see what you think the rules of magnets are and the rules of static electricity are, and then compare and contrast with the actual person. I think there is a way to teach this through the history. And I think it is a profound way. The problem is teachers are so overwhelmed with how much to do and there's no books like this. Even my book is I think could be helpful, but it is not a lesson plan.
Yeah, what I was going to add is that, being a teacher in New York State, all they cared about is how my kids did on this Regents exam at the end of the year. I could be the greatest teacher or the worst teacher, as long as my scores were good at the end. That's all they cared about. And, you have no choice but to basically, I used to joke that the day you started teaching, the first day of school, you're already behind. You're on this kind of, treadmill where you're like racing to keep up, and you got, if you're not onto the next topic the following week, you're behind, so as much as I tried to incorporate that kind of stuff, the curriculum itself didn't allow that. Of course, if I was teaching a course that wasn't part of the state curriculum, that wasn't assessed by the state, then you have a lot more flexibility. So if I had been able to teach an elective, say in physics, maybe that could have happened. But it's such a small school, there was just no possibility of doing that. There wouldn't be enough students to take it.
Right. Honestly, I think that I found that I mean I've definitely had that same thing and the same rules. I found that when I tried to fit everything in that they asked me to, the students didn't necessarily, you can teach it, but
Sure.
they don't necessarily get it. But I found that it's surprising how much you can do through the history. There's these very complicated equations called Maxwell's equations. And Richard Feynman took about 4 weeks to cover them, I think. They're
Oh, sure.
complicated. The math is complicated. Everything's complicated. And I made a video driving them, getting them from the original concepts. And that's one of my videos that's a little bit advanced for most people who are
Sure.
not in physics. But I did it through the history. Now, not through the detailed history. It was much more superficial history. But it was amazing how quickly it makes, I think, including the history, it makes, in general, in physics, we've been propping everything up with the math. And I feel like the math should be the tool, not the
I agree.
structure. And if you prop it up with these people, it's amazing how much the material sticks with people and is easier to teach and get through the ridiculous amount of material that they require of physics teachers.
I mean, the two things that I really liked about physics is uh, it was good at predicting things. You could say, if I launch this here at a certain angle at a certain speed, where's it going to land? And it would always land right there. But the other thing is the demos. I mean, kids used to joke I always was blowing things up in the class, but I never did blow anything up. But some of the demos, are pretty crazy. And though, in addition to the stories, being able to do these demonstrations, that, you talk in the book about the Van de Graaff generator. I mean, it, I had no problem wasting a lab period, 80 minutes, showing everything you could do with that. It's just a fun thing and it gets them really interested in science. And I'd actually show it to my earth science students simply because I figured if they really like this, maybe in 3 years they'll take physics also. It's kind of like a little teaser. Hey, look at these fun things you can do in this class.
The Van de Graaff is an endless delight, isn't it? But
Hmm.
I don't know if you noticed this. So I don't know if your audience knows this. Van de Graaff is this. It looks like a metal mushroom, and
Hmm.
inside it has a belt. And when you spin the belt, it collects extra charges. So if you put your hands on it and you're standing on an insulating stand, your hair will stand up, and you can get sparks and you can get things to light up, and it's fun. And it turned out, I don't know if you read my book, that it has a precursor in this. They used to do this to entertain people, not just entertain school children, but entertain nobility, entertain the height of the height, especially in France. They would have these glass. Didn't have a metal. They had a glass thing that they spun by hand, and then they would have hair stick up, and they would give my favorite electric kisses. They would give shocking kisses and then write bad poetry about it. Or they'd have this jar that would collect the charges and then give out shocks. Um, and I was, it was fun for me to think that all of our experiments in the modern classroom were sort of this pale imitation of royalty demonstrations in the 1700s. And that, because there was a limit to how much we were to do our students.
I was going to add, and I don't know if the story is true, but maybe about 3 hours from me is in Boston is the science center that they have one of those hands-on type science centers, and they have a room, the giant theater you go into, and it has a giant Van de Graaff generator, these two tall towers with the balls, and of course the operator stands in a cage, Faraday's cage at the bottom. What I've heard, and again, I'm not sure if this is true, that those are the original Van de Graaff generators that Van de Graaff used in his experiments because he was trying to smash atoms, is my understanding, and they weren't powerful enough. And he donated them to the museum. But since they couldn't get them into the museum, they put them in the parking lot. They set them up and they built the building around them. So I don't know if that story is true. That's just what I've heard. There's something for you to look into there.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure I've heard of any of that part. So
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's an incredible show. I mean, I'm sure other science museums have similar setups today, but I'm told those are the original ones that Van de Graaff used. So you got to take a trip to Boston someday. There you
yes, definitely.
go. So let me ask you, how did you go from being a physics teacher
Yeah.
to now doing YouTube videos? I mean, how did you end up there?
So what happened was I was teaching part-time, and I had my second child and ended up staying at home. And I thought, well, I had trouble getting another part-time job after having two children.
Hmm.
And I didn't want to have a full-time job because, as you know, full-time physics teaching is a lot of work. And so I thought maybe, and at the same time, I had a lunch with this lady, and I told her about teaching high school, and she said she was too stupid to understand how electricity works. And it broke my heart. It breaks my heart when their education left them feeling stupid. It breaks my heart. And I feel like that's the opposite of physics. Physics is all about, why is this happening? What's going on here? Where is this going on? And it felt like the opposite of that. And I felt that there was, I felt really good about teaching high school students, but I felt like there was a group of people who I was missing, which is all the adults who had gone through high school and gone through college, maybe, or even, this woman was a lawyer, so gone through law school, but had felt like the scientific world was beyond her. And I thought, well, maybe, and I really wanted to learn more about the history of science, because when I was teaching physics, I would put little bits in there, but I just didn't have enough time to really study the history. And so I thought, well, I'll study the history and then I'll write a book. So they'll learn the physics through the history. I'll learn the history through the physics, and we'll have a good time. So I started writing that and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the process. I fell in love with meeting all these people through the history. I felt like I never really understood what they did until I learned who they were as people and why they did what they did. And after about a year of that, I thought I was almost done with my book, which I was not. And I was having lunch with a friend, and I said, what should I do with this? Should I write a blog? How do I get people who don't know me personally to read the book? And she said, Kathy, you like to talk, start a blog. And I said, well, what's a blog? And she said, YouTube. And I said, oh, YouTube, I know what YouTube is. So I started this channel. And I also fell in love with the channel. I mean, I legit just started it so I could get people to read my book whenever it was out. And then I fell in love with the process. I felt it's a different each my book is very episodic. It's linked, but it's little stories that are linked to each other. And my videos are little stories that are linked to each other. Although every once in a while I'm like, next time, and then next time hasn't come yet because I get diverted, squirrel, and then suddenly I'm talking about something else. But the YouTube channel gives me freedom to study things that I just think are cool that don't necessarily fit into a book. You know, like I did one on the history of the Nobel Prizes, Alfred Nobel, and why they made the Nobel Prizes, and that there is a story about it, and the story is not true. The story did it to revive his reputation, but that was just made up by a biographer. A very And then everyone copied that biographer and copied the biographer because they liked the story. But no, he didn't do it that way.
So how often do you put out videos?
It is completely erratic. I've had periods where I had a video a week, and I've had periods where 6 months go by without a video. It depends on what I'm working on, and also if I what else is going on in my life. I just moved, and like
Well, that'll be a nice little interruption, right? I mean,
exactly. But yeah, I was trying to be on a regular schedule for a hot second, and then I realized that, you know what, the only way that I can keep the quality the way I want it to and tell the stories that I want to tell. And some of my stories take 7 minutes and some take an hour. And so I wanted to, and everything is very, very, very well researched. Everything has original sources to it. So sometimes it takes me a long time to put it together. So I wish I could tell you a more, I publish every Thursday, every other
yeah.
Thursday. No, I really don't publish every other Thursday.
Yeah, when I first started my podcast, I tried the first few months, I was trying for every week, but I realized there was no way I could keep that up. And then I noticed it went to about 2 weeks, and it went to 3 weeks, and then I kind of settled on every 4 or 5 weeks or so. And for the first 11 years, I was putting out 10 or 11 episodes per year. And then probably like 5, 6, 7 years ago, I can't even, it just becomes a blur after a while.
Mm-hmm.
I was approached by these two guys, and they were starting a history podcast network, and they wanted me to join. And I said, I'm not really interested. I wasn't making any money from the podcast. I was actually losing. I figure it was cost me about $1,000 a year to keep the podcast going, but there were no ads. There was nothing. I could. I think the law. I once went 3 months. I was working on my house. We just bought the house, and I was, redoing our living room. I went 3 months without recording an episode. I liked not being obligated to
Yes.
be on a schedule. And I said to them, I don't do it for the money. I did it because I said I'm doing it because it's a hobby, and I don't want to be, where I have to have a new podcast every month, that I have to, but they convinced me to do it, and I'm on my second network now, and I'm not really sure it's worth it. It brings in a little bit of money. Honestly, after I subtract all my expenses, I'm not really earning that much. They don't do a heck of a lot to promote my podcasts. Just switched to a new network last January, not this January, last January, a year ago. I've seen no growth. It's just a money making thing for them, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think eventually I'm going to move back to kind of what you're doing. Just as long as it takes to put a story together, that's what it takes.
Right.
And I also wanted to add, I know I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but you just reminded me of all these things, you know. But years ago, when I started researching, you had to go to a library. There was
Right.
no way to. I mean, now I rarely ever leave my seat. Oddly, I just did a story recently about this guy, very what I call a small story about this man who they wanted to build a mall, but he wouldn't sell his house. And they kept
Mm-hmm.
offering him more and more money. And he just refused. He's like, this is my house. And he set his price and they wouldn't meet it. And he wasn't going anywhere. Um, and I started that story like 10 years ago, maybe more, a little bit more than that. But I had so many unanswered questions. So I just put it aside. Now I
Mm-hmm.
come back to it 10 years later. And because there's so much more information out there, newspaper archives, ancestry, things that just if they did exist years ago, they were very incomplete. And every day there's more and more and more stuff available. And it's just that much easier to do research. So that's all I just wanted to throw that in because you were commenting about how much time you spend researching.
Oh, but it's astonishing what you can do from your home, and astonishing what I can read papers from the 1700s, and I just type it in the thing, and there it is. And then I find the original quote. It's amazing to me. Yeah. And I'm I don't think I could have done anything that I did if I hadn't started when I started. If I hadn't started when the internet was robust enough, research was robust enough, I couldn't have
Sure.
done any of this research.
Yeah, when I wrote my first book, I remember the nearest university well, there's two major colleges by me. There's RPI, the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and then there's University of Albany, which is a public university. And I remember going to University of Albany, going into the basement and using
Mm-hmm.
microfilm and loading up these reels and trying to using the reader's guide and all these other abstract there are other indexes that are a little bit more in depth than the reader's guide, but having them locate the article and then paying 10 cents per copy to print everything out, and now I just don't even leave my desk.
Exactly. That's why I dedicated my book to the archivist.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
both the people who saved them and the people who put them online, because now I mean, someone or multiple people collected all of the early radio magazines and wireless magazines from the early 1900s, and you can just read 1922 magazine. And the only problem with that is that you are trying to read one article, and then it's not easy to just read that one article.
Yeah, it's a black hole, as they say.
Well, it's such a window into the world. That was the thing about the history that I was not expecting. It's such a window into our past. I mean, I think of When I think of the early 1800s, I think of Jane Austen, because that's my window into the early
Hmm.
1800s. But now I have other windows into that time period. I have Irish mathematician and his past and his love letters and 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 that's a totally different view of a similar time period, just from a different window. And we're used to history either being vague or being specific about kings, queens, you
Sure.
know, generals. And when you study scientists, you get to study specific about people from all walks of life. And you see what they write as love letters. And you see what they're concerned about and how they argue with each other and what they're, even if they aren't from, these aren't just the letters of kings and queens, these are the letters of ordinary people who
Sure.
are also extraordinary people. Um, and because people tend to keep their letters, it's it's such an it's such a beautiful and unique window into the past. I and also, like, the technology, understanding how the technology changed their world. I mean, we think of technology changing our world, but it certainly does. But how did the world work? How did things change when there was a telegraph? There was this famous case where this man killed his girlfriend, and he was an and he escaped. He left after killing his girlfriend, and they saw him, and he got on a train, and so they sent a signal on the telegraph. You like this story, that this person matching this description, he was a Quaker, and this was in England, and they sent it on the telegram so that they captured him on the other end of the
I've heard this story. I can't pick out the names, but it was on a podcast or something I was listening to. They told that story. It may have been Criminal. I have a feeling the podcast Criminal,
uh,
which I don't listen to any particular podcast regularly. What happens is like if we go away on vacation and we're driving many hours, I'll just listen to a whole batch at one time, And I'm pretty sure that was one of the stories that they told. I would guess it was the podcast Criminal, but I honestly don't remember the name. So that is a good story. So I didn't mean to cut you off though.
my favorite part about that is that the particular type of, this was not the telegraph the way we think of it with the dots and the dashes. This was a different kind of telegraph where they had three arrows that went one way or the other, and in a pattern, to memorize. And they didn't have all the letters because you didn't need to use all the letters.
Sure.
So they didn't have a Q for Quaker. So I can't remember. I think they spelled it K, uh, K U. They spelled
Yeah.
it with a K, and there was a lot of repeat of like, wait, what? But they managed to catch their person, and were very excited. This was the first person caught by telegraph, and it made it very popular.
Yeah. One thing as I'm reading the book is I just can't help but think how modern electricity is. I'm not talking about, what we have today, but 150 years ago, nobody had anything in their home. I mean,
Right.
even 100 years ago, most people did not have electric lights in their house. It just reminds me of my grandfather. He passed on, oh gosh, maybe about 10 years ago now. But he lived to, well, it's a question. He either lived to 106 or he lived to 108. I think 106, but he used to say 108. And one day I'm just talking. He's probably about 103, 104, and I called him just to, say hello. And I just started asking him, like, when was the first time you saw a car? When was the first time,
Mm-hmm.
you saw electricity? Or because he grew up in a home, when he was born, there was no electric, there was no plumbing in his house. He was brought to the US maybe when he was 3 or 4 or 5. There's some question on that also. But he told me, like the first time he ever saw a car was a doctor's car. First time he heard radio, the first time he saw television. I mean, we take these things for granted today. And yet here's a man who, passed away, probably a decade ago and had seen all these things. He went from nothing to, man landing on the moon, It's just kind of
Right.
crazy.
Well, they described, well, a very disreputable, that's not how you say it, uh, a not very honorable U.S. congressman who had a secret deal with Samuel Morse to get the telegraph out.
Oh, yes, I
Also
remember that.
said
Yes.
that the telegraph was defying space and time. I think he put it at, which I thought was very, very well said. It was like,
Yes. And it did.
and it did. It changed. I mean, just to think, like, how did you deal with a medical emergency before phones, before how did that work? How did you deal with fires before cars and telephones I mean all these things? It is striking how modern even the most basic things of our world is.
It's pretty incredible if you sit back, especially after reading your book and you realize most of what you're talking about. I mean, you do start at the very beginning, with
Mm.
I'm trying to remember, but basically you started with this I can't remember the name, but this guy
William
is a
Gilbert.
doctor, right? He was a
Yeah,
doctor, and he figured out magnetism and electricity weren't the same thing. Am I correct?
that is correct. He was Queen Elizabeth's doctor. So
Yeah.
1580 to 1600, really long time ago. But
Yeah, but really most I'd say there's lots of developments, but until you get to the days of, Joseph Henry and like to me that's when electricity really just took off. When they realized they could make motors out of it and actually make money off of electricity, I think that's when it really
right.
took off.
And that honestly, the motors was like the early 1800s, but the make money off of it was the late 1800s. It was like 1876, I think. There was this Russian man named Yabaklov, and he went to Paris to escape his debts in Russia, and he invented this kind of light. It's this bright arc lamp. It was called. It's kind of like a welder's arc.
Hmm.
And what he invented was the problem was is if you used the battery and you had this welder's arc, one end would decay faster than the other and it would go out. So he found this way to make it sort of have two pieces and decay at the same time, but it only really worked with alternating current. Anyway, he displayed this in France in 1876, I'm going to say. I might be off by a couple years. And suddenly the world was like, oh my gosh, we can make money off this. And it's amazing how quickly things changed from that. That was the one where it's just like, oh my gosh, we can make money off of this. Was the thing that sort of flipped the switch, so to speak, pardon the pun.
So, of course, we can't talk forever. I thought the one story I wanted you to tell was, and you can just tell it briefly, is about Laura Bassi. That was one that really intrigued me in the book. So, why don't you just give a quick rundown on that?
Oh, Laura Bassi. So what happened was I was looking into something about the history of radio, and I was reading about this other woman, and I was reading about this other woman named Bertha Ayrton, and it said, and she was a scientist in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it said there was a newspaper article that said she's the first woman who worked in electricity since Laura Bassi in the 1700s. And I'm like, Laura who? Laura what? I'd never heard of this woman. So I look into it, and there was this woman, and she was in Italy, And she was in this town, and they were on hard times, and she was known as a genius. Ever since she was a little girl, she could translate into multiple languages. She could do logic, she could do math, she could do science, she could do whatever. And her father and cousin would have her go out and do demonstrations of her brilliance. And they decided to allow her to earn her PhD in this town in order to get attention to the town. It's like um, a way of a tourism base, like come see the thinking woman. So she does this thing because usually you would get your PhD inside, but no, this was an open air. They had parades, they made coins, they had poetry. They had big arguments about like what order the different people would be in the parade. Like it was the whole thing. So she does this whole thing. She gets her PhD. She's the second woman to get her PhD and in the modern world. And then she writes, she's like, the honor has been given to me, has been greater than I could ever imagine. And they're like, that's great, no teaching. And she's like, what do you mean no teaching? And they were like, you can give public demonstrations and you can write poetry, but no teaching because of your gender. And she said, well, what if I teach at home? And they said, to men? That's even worse. So what she ended up doing is she got married, and the people who had promoted her were extra offended that she got married. And she said, I'm getting married so that I can be a professor. And they were like, no, this is terrible. You're destroying your name. No, 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 no. But she did. She got married, and she ended up being like the church had limited. They had a whole bunch of books that only people with PhDs who were over 24 could read. And so she was the only woman who could legally read these books in Italy. And she started this school, and it became very, very popular. It became so popular because she loved experiment, and she wasn't constrained by all the rules of that they put on the professors at the university, that she ended up being the most famous scientist in her town in Bologna. And like Volta wrote to her and dedicated things to her. What was the gosh?
Galvani. Galvani, right?
Galvani was her student. Yeah, so all these people would come and visit her. She was very important. And when the head of the science department died, actually, first the head of the science department died, and her husband became the new head assistant. And then he died, I guess it was a very unsafe position. And then when that happened, her husband wasn't famous enough for him to be a professor. And so they just said, okay, forget it. You're not only allowed to teach in the university, you can become the head of the science department. So she finally became the head of the science department. And then unfortunately, she had a heart attack like 3 years later. And the whole city mourned. And she was buried in this church in the town. And you can still see her grave there, right next to her student Galvani, who was famous for discovering, few years after her death, that two different metals could cause frogs to jump, and animal electricity, which started the whole world of the battery.
Yeah, it's a really great little, and I think that story kind of encapsulates your book. There's lots of small stories, things you probably didn't know, a little quirky, interesting, and as you're telling it, people always ask me, where do you find these stories? I have very, very obscure things, and I just say I read, and I kind of do what you do. I'll see one sentence, and that just sets me off on a
And
tangent
start digging.
somewhere. Yeah, and I'm like, wow, there's a story here, and that's exactly what you did. So Kathy, I just want to thank you for being on the podcast. It's been great. Again, the book is The Lightning Tamers, and where can you find the book if people want to read it?
Amazon or bookstore or library.
Sure. Same thing with me. And of course, your YouTube channel, which has over 180,000 subscribers, that's incredible, is Kathy Loves Physics and History. And I did check this out. If you just type in Kathy Loves Physics, it will pop up. So it's a really great channel. And on the web, it's kathylovesphysics.com. And again, I just want to thank you for being on the podcast. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Thank you so much, Steve. This has been great.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So why don't we just say goodbye to everyone? So bye.
Bye.
Well, I do hope you enjoyed that interview with Kathy. Now, before I go, I just want to suggest that you check out my podcast, which is called the Useless Information Podcast. And I've been recording it since the Stone Age. That's 2008, and that really is the Stone Age of podcasting. Anyway, it's a collection of some of the most obscure, unusual, odd, and bizarre true stories from the flip side of history. The podcast has had millions upon millions of downloads, so I'm quite certain that there's something there for everyone, and that includes you. You can find the Useless Information Podcast on all the leading podcast platforms, so be sure to check it out. I do think you'll enjoy it. Thanks.